Democrats have no response. They have no counter-argument. The safer America becomes, the more they will complain. And in response, every American who's paying attention will recognize their party for what it is. They are the party of chaos, crime, and cartels. You have to imagine there are more than a few panicked conversations going on this evening over at the headquarters of Tren de Aragua, the Venezuelan gang that routinely traffics drugs into this country and takes over apartment complexes in places like Colorado. As you may have seen, 7 months after the Trump administration designated Tren de Aragua as a foreign terrorist organization, the U.S. military just blew up one of the gang's drug boats as it sped towards the United States. There was no warning. The Coast Guard didn't try to take them into custody. Instead, the boat and all 11 people on board were bombed and eliminated, presumably with the help of one of the warships that the White House has recently deployed to the Southern Caribbean. After decades of having open access to the U.S., this development had to be quite a shock for Tren de Aragua and every terrorist group that engages in drug trafficking. Until now, the absolute worst-case scenario is that they might get detained very briefly, maybe have to answer a few awkward questions about why they're heading towards the United States on a boat with 4 outboard motors and millions of dollars worth of narcotics. And then some NGO armed with tax dollars, commandeered by the Democrat Party, would jump into action and spring them loose, as Ivy League academics demanded that we respect the civil liberties of sociopathic foreign drug traffickers. But that's not what happened this time. Instead, the NGOs and academics weren't given any time to intercede on behalf of Tren de Aragua. Federal judges weren't given that opportunity either. There's simply no chance that a federal judge with a name out of a Star Wars movie can issue any kind of injunction at this point, ordering the Trump administration to form a dive team and go on down there and piece all the dead bodies back together. That's not going to work. We just simply killed them all instead. And as you might expect, our moral superiors aren't very happy about this. Here's how one Princeton professor and self-styled human rights advocate, a guy named Kenneth Roth, responded to the destruction of the drug boat. Quote, "Drug trafficking is a crime, not an act of war. Traffickers must be arrested, not summarily executed, which U.S. forces just illegally did." And there were dozens more posts like this, all of them complaining about the destruction of a boat full of drug traffickers. The Trump administration didn't respond to any of these people. Instead, one by one, the official accounts of various officials and departments in the administration, including Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, the rapid response team, posted the footage of the boat exploding without apology. The White House also posted memes like this one. The caption reads, "Terrorists eliminated, adios." Not exactly a subtle message. But what makes it so effective is that, predictably, no one on the left has any idea how to respond. Their default tactic, which is to stall, file frivolous lawsuits, wage large-scale propaganda campaigns, that simply doesn't work anymore. So instead of accomplishing anything, they're stammering on the internet about how it's supposedly a terrible thing that drug boats are being destroyed. They can't explain why that's so terrible or what negative consequence that will actually have for us. They're aghast at the possibility that for the first time in recent memory, the U.S. military is actually carrying out airstrikes for the benefit of the American people. And the American people overwhelmingly support it. As scandalous as this may be to left-wing, anti-human academics, most Americans feel the way that I do about it. And my take is very simple. Kill the foreign drug traffickers who bring poison into our country. Kill them all. Mass slaughter of the drug cartels. Leave no one alive. That's what I'd like to see. It's what most Americans would like to see. And it is, in fact, the moral and just course of action. Now, the White House recognizes the abject weakness that Democrats are displaying at the moment. And that's why the other day, the president announced that the U.S. military would continue to take action to protect the homeland. The city of Chicago is up next. Watch.
Mind up on Chicago, though?
Well, we're going in. I didn't say when. We're going in. When you lose, look, I have an obligation. This isn't a political thing. I have an obligation. When we lose, when 20 people are killed over the last 2.5 weeks and 75 are shot with bullets. So let me tell you a little story about a place called D.C., District of Columbia, right here where we are. It's now a safe zone. We have no crime. It's in such great shape. You can go and actually walk with your children, your wife, your husband. You can walk right down the middle of the street. You're not going to be shot, Peter. You're safe.
Now, just so you know, there's nothing, despite what you may have heard, there's nothing unprecedented about using the National Guard to establish order when local authorities prove unable or unwilling to do so. You take the shooting at Kent State in 1970 during riots over the Vietnam War, for example. Four college students were killed and 9 were wounded by the National Guard. And in many schools today, this episode is taught as the Kent State Massacre. Pretty much every university in the country claims that this shooting was a clear example of brutality by the U.S. military. But at the time, the public overwhelmingly supported the National Guard. People understood that these students had been rioting and threatening people with deadly weapons for days. They had burned down a building on campus. They were unruly. They were a clear threat to public safety. They had cornered the National Guard troops and were advancing on them. And, that's what actually happened. And in fact, as recently as 2 decades ago, Chicago's leaders were openly talking about bringing in the National Guard on their own. Here's a report from the Associated Press in 2008, quote, Illinois Governor Blagojevich surprised Mayor Daley on July 16th by offering to send state police or even the National Guard to battle out-of-control crime in Chicago. So there's nothing crazy or unprecedented about what the Trump administration is proposing now. And Democrats realize that, presumably. So in response, rather than construct any kind of rational argument, they're resorting to panicked non sequiturs. Here's one alderman in the city of Chicago making his counter argument, if you can call it that. Listen.
How do you respond to the argument that there were something like 50 plus shootings, 52 people, I should say, were shot in Chicago, 30 different shootings over the holiday weekend, 7 people killed? Aren't numbers like that still a problem that your city needs to address? What more can be done to address that?
Well, I think that what we need to do is we also had a mass shooting in a Catholic school. We also have had many instances where the administration has really escalated, exacerbated the violence in our country, in our cities. Trump is a dictator. I think we got to be very clear. He's trying to normalize violence. He's trying to normalize military deployment in American cities like LA, DC, Chicago, and many others to come. But what we have not seen is really a systemic investment that will actually address the core issues. I had shootings in my ward. One of them was a tragic shooting of an unhoused neighbor. So the Trump administration is saying that they're going to address the issue of unhoused residents by putting them in jails, in concentration camps?
Yes, his very first response when asked about the extraordinary levels of crime and violence in his hometown is to talk about the murder of 2 children in a Catholic church by a trans-identified shooter in another state. This is a trans-identified mass shooter whose demonic ideology was affirmed at the highest levels of the Democrat Party. And yet that's the defense he's offering. Oh, you're worried about the constant shootings in Chicago? Well, that's absurd because our party is also responsible for mass shootings in other states too. Now, if you notice, CNN introduced this guy in the Chiron as a Chicago alderman for ward with large Hispanic population. So apparently we're supposed to treat him as a credible talking head on this particular issue because he comes from a ward with a lot of Hispanics. Even though he uses every single DNC buzzword that he can, he just crams them all in. He calls homeless people unhoused folks. He says Trump is a dictator. He talks about concentration camps. Then he demands a systemic investment, meaning more tax money. So just, he goes down the bingo. He's got all the boxes on the bingo card checked there. You just know this guy goes around saying Latinx on top of all this. So it's a complete train wreck, but this is all they have. Meanwhile, residents of Chicago are being terrorized by repeat offenders who obviously belong in prison. Watch.
13 mugshots of Livingston going back to 2012. A large number of those arrests for aggravated assault and battery of both women and police officers, something Miles found out after the fact.
Like, what is enough? What does someone have to do where they're going to be held accountable?
According to online records, Livingston's history of random acts of violence against women goes back 8 years. In 2017, he was accused of randomly attacking 2 women months apart. Both cases were dropped. In 2022, Livingston was sentenced to 5 years in prison after prosecutors said he punched and attempted to rob 4 women within 20 minutes in the Loop. And yet, just 14 months later, in 2023, while on parole, Livingston was arrested for hitting a woman in the face on North Michigan Avenue. And in 2024, he was sentenced to 100 days in prison after punching a 15-year-old girl, also on North Michigan.
Now, any sane person watching reports like this would realize that Chicago has a major problem. It's not enforcing the law or punishing criminals. So maybe they should start with that. Instead, Chicago's Mayor Brandon Johnson has decided to deflect blame in probably the most pathetic and unconvincing way that he possibly could. Yesterday, he announced that red states are somehow responsible for all of the violent crime in the city that he leads. Watch.
And they've made historic progress. However, we will never be able to end gun violence in Chicago as long as the president continues to allow tens of thousands of guns to be trafficked into our state and our city. The vast majority of guns do not come from Chicago. They are not made in Cook County. They are not bought in the state of Illinois. These guns come from red states. They are coming from Indiana. They are coming from Mississippi. They are coming from Louisiana. And that is the harsh reality. Chicago will continue to have a violence problem as long as red states continue to have a gun problem. Shootings will continue as long as this presidential administration continues to put politics over people.
Yes, the shootings will continue, says Brandon Johnson. He really just said that. He doesn't seem to realize what he just said. He couldn't have made it any more clear that he views the violence in Chicago as a core building block of his political power. He might as well have announced the shootings will continue until morale improves. I mean, that's basically the tone. Think about the logic here. Yes, there are constant shootings in Chicago, Brandon Johnson concedes, but they'll continue to take place if Donald Trump gets involved. So I guess we're looking at what, a wash? Is that the idea? But we get to the absurdity, before we get to the absurdity of Johnson's underlying argument, it needs to be said that he's changing his position here. Just so you know, just a year ago, when he was asked also about why Chicago is so dangerous and dysfunctional, at that point, Johnson was blaming Richard Nixon, of all people. Watch.
So we cut off the pipeline of boys between the ages of 10 and 19 being either victims or the perpetrators. So, yeah, it is personal. Black death has been unfortunately accepted in this country for a very long time. We had a chance 60 years ago to get at the root causes, and people mocked President Johnson, and we ended up with Richard Nixon. I'm going to work hard every day to transform this city. That's what it takes to build a better, stronger, safer Chicago, and I need everybody to step up.
So we've gone from Richard Nixon being the one at fault from the grave. He's haunting Chicago and causing all the violence. And then we went from that to the idea that guns from red states are responsible, which is quite a pivot. The people in charge can't fix a pothole, but they want you to trust them with your drinking water. Ask people in Flint, Michigan, how that turned out. Lead, heavy metals, rust, basically liquid poison straight from the tap. That's why I suggest the Cove Pure water purifier to keep your family safe, because unlike the government, Cove Pure actually does its job. America's tap water is a cocktail of heavy metals and toxins, the fallout of corroded pipes that should have been replaced decades ago. Lead exposure, by the way, doesn't just make your water taste like you're chewing on a car battery. It causes brain damage, cancer, birth defects. But sure, trust the city council with your children's brains. What could possibly go wrong, right? Well, Cove Pure is the obvious fix. Their clear wave technology removes up to 99.9% of contaminants, lead, PFAs, pharmaceuticals, you name it. No plumbers, no drilling. Just plug it in on the countertop, set the temperature you want with the touchscreen, and it actually tastes like water. Imagine that. So don't wait around for the government to solve this. They won't. So go to covepure.com/Walsh right now. Get $200 off while supplies last. Take back control of your family's health and finally drink water the way it was meant to be. But let's give Brandon Johnson the benefit of the doubt and look into the numbers here. First of all, if you pull up the data from the ATF's website, here's what you'll find. And this is from 2022. It shows where firearms that were recovered in Illinois were originally purchased, assuming that the ATF could make that determination. And as you can see, Illinois is the top source by far. So his state is the top source of these guns. Roughly 7,500 firearms that were recovered in the state of Illinois were originally purchased from Illinois. The next highest states are Indiana and Missouri, which were responsible for 2,500 and 1,000 firearms respectively. And if you add up all the other states in the top 15, you'll find that in more than 50% of cases, the firearms were originally purchased in Illinois. Now, this is not a surprising or significant finding in any way, and it certainly doesn't implicate red states so much as it implicates blue cities. Both Indiana and Missouri, as we all know, are home to many loyal Democrat Party voters. And some of those Democrat Party voters will move across state lines. And the problem isn't the fact that these people are capable of traveling. It's the fact that they're committing violent crimes. I mean, there's a reason why if you look up the top 10 most violent cities in America, 9 out of 10 are led by Democrats. Whether they're in red states or not, as we all know, this is a common deflection from these people. They say, well, look at the violence in red states. Yeah, where's that violence happening? It's happening in the cities. And who's in charge of the cities? The Democrats are. Out of the top 10 most violent cities in America, 9 of the 10 are run by Democrats. That's 90%. So trying to pin this on Republicans is a form of gaslighting that could only be done by the same people who tried to convince us that men can get pregnant. I mean, they are very accustomed to denying basic reality, and so here they continue. Also, here's a question, Brandon. Let's just take the guns that do come into Chicago from red states. Okay, let's pretend that all of the guns. Let's go along with that fantasy that they're all coming from red states. And let's even pretend that not only are they all coming from red states, but they're coming from red areas of red states, meaning the rural areas, not the cities. None of this is true, but let's pretend. Well, Brandon, why do those guns only become a problem once they make it into Chicago? Why do these guns suddenly start killing people in Chicago when they weren't killing people in rural Indiana? Why is that? If the guns are coming from rural Indiana, then and the guns are the problem, then we should see that the violence in Indiana is worse than it is in Chicago, given that Indiana is the source. But that's not the case. It's a strange thing. The guns don't start killing people until they get into Chicago. Do the guns just take on a life of their own? Do they come to life like some rated R version of Toy Story? Or do the actual humans in Chicago decide to use those guns to commit violent crimes, which would mean the problem is with the people in your city, not the objects? Now, this is a concept that obviously leftists struggle to understand, but if you work with them, then sometimes you can get them to understand it a little bit. In fact, I just had this experience with Stephen King. Of course, the famous author, Stephen King. And after the mass shooting by the trans guy at the Catholic Church, I pointed out that trans-identified people are mentally unwell and doctors should be legally barred from affirming their confusion, like we talked about on the show after the shooting. Stephen King responded to my post by posting this. Trans is not the problem. He had a gun. That's the problem. Now, I replied to Stephen King and I said, I have multiple guns. I've never murdered anyone in my life. Somehow, even with my guns, I have never experienced the temptation to spray bullets into a church. It turns out that if you aren't a mentally ill freak, having a gun isn't a problem at all. And then, get this, Stephen King, in a moment of accidental mental clarity, said, and you see the tweet here, yes, but you're sane. Well, yes, Stephen, that's right. You finally got it. Congratulations, Stephen. You're in your 60s now. Yes, exactly. So you see that it's not the gun, as you originally said in your tweet. It's not the gun, it's the person. Because just a second ago, you were saying, oh, no, it's not that. It's the guns. It was the exact quote. It's the guns. And then I pointed out that, well, I have a bunch of guns and I've never killed anybody. I never even wanted to commit murder. I've never even come close to it. It's just not in the realm of possibility for me. Well, why is that? Well, as you point out, well, it's because I'm not insane. So it's not the gun. It is the person. It seems we have a breakthrough with Stephen King. Now, if only we could do the same thing with these Democrat politicians, but instead they all play the same game that Brandon Johnson plays. Gavin Newsom has been doing this. J.B. Pritzker has also joined in. Watch.
The president, and let's talk about the press secretary for the president, doesn't seem to understand that it's actually Republican states that have the crime problem. That of the 20 states that have the biggest crime problem, 13 of them are red states controlled by Republican governors. Why is he choosing? In fact, of those 20 states, we're at the bottom. Why is he choosing that over going after a red state that voted for him, rather than a blue state that didn't vote for him?
So once again, there's this conflation of red states with blue cities inside red states, which are, of course, are the real problem. But what's left unspoken here is that in red states, there are cities controlled by Democrats where extraordinary levels of crime and violence take place. And many of these cities have majority black populations or close to it. That's the very inconvenient fact that you're not supposed to talk about. But the truth is, you simply can't explain the disparity in crime numbers without talking about demographics. And when you're talking about demographics, you also have to talk about the fact that something like 80% of black children in Chicago are born to single mothers. If black women in the city of Chicago stopped having kids before marriage, and if black men stopped abandoning their families, the crime problem would all but go away. I mean, just the slightest bit of self-control would fix all of this. But Brandon doesn't want to mention that. I wonder why. Instead, he openly declared an insurrection against the United States government, saying that residents of Chicago should rise up and resist the National Guard. This is just sedition, is what this is, very clearly. Listen.
Are you prepared to defend this land that was built by slaves, a land that was built by indigenous people, a land that is built by workers? Are you prepared to defend this land? The people united will always prevail. I need you all to stand firm, to stand strong. If this president decides to continue to break this Constitution.
Well, before we even get to the sedition, it's just layers of dishonesty that we have here on top of more dishonesty. Chicago was not, for the record, in any sense, built by slaves and indigenous people. Okay, that's just not true. Also, the country as a whole was not built by slaves and indigenous people. That is also not true. We could have never had slavery, and this country would still exist. But especially for him to be saying that in that particular city makes no sense. Eastern Europeans, along with Irish and German immigrants, are responsible for the development of Chicago as we know it today. It wasn't slaves from Africa who built the Illinois and Michigan Canal, which is what transformed the city of Chicago into a major hub of transportation and commerce. Slavery was illegal in Illinois. It was immigrants, mostly Irishmen, who constructed it. Useless bureaucrats like Brandon Johnson had no role in it whatsoever. This is back at a time, as we've talked about many times, when people say, oh, we're a nation of immigrants. Well, if you go back a century and a half, if you go back decades and centuries, what you'll find is that there was a time when immigrants came here, people came from other parts of the world to literally help build the country. They built, and these were, this distinction I've drawn so many times, these were really pioneers. There's a difference between what we think of today as an immigrant who comes to an already fully built country in order to take advantage of it, in order to benefit from it. That's one thing. That's what we have these days. But back in the old days, you had pioneers, really. You had people coming and building this place. which is very different from what we have now. And again, it wasn't bureaucrats like Brandon Johnson either. And you know, they shouldn't suggest otherwise or even talk about the development of the city of Chicago until they learn some basic history about their own city. But we all know why Brandon Johnson is lying like this. His goal is to dismantle the rule of law in Chicago. He's been working on that goal for some time. Last year, he got rid of shot spotter technology, which allowed law enforcement to pinpoint the location of any shooting within seconds. Watch.
Well, there's been a lot of concern from city aldermen and community organizations as ShotSpotter is set to expire at midnight tonight. Mayor Brandon Johnson announced today a city request for information to look into other possible technology systems, but many are concerned about public safety while that entire process plays out. After months of contentious debate among city leaders, ShotSpotter gun detection technology will officially stop being used in Chicago tonight. Aldermen voted 33-14 earlier this week to keep the technology system, falling one short of a veto-proof majority. That led to Mayor Brandon Johnson vowing to veto, effectively ending the technology that has monitored Chicago's neighborhoods for more than 6 years.
We hear the mayor talk about building a stronger, safer Chicago, but this doesn't do that when you're taking away this type of technology.
Now, when you hear politicians like Brandon Johnson claim that they have solutions, remember videos like this one. They've gone out of their way to make violent crime much, much worse in Chicago. This is a deliberate effort that they've embarked on. Now, it's true that in our federal system, states are not required to assist the federal government in carrying out certain policy objectives, but it's also true that states and local government cannot actively interfere with the federal government's decision to enforce the law. That is not states' rights. That is treason. Brandon Johnson is openly encouraging residents of Chicago to engage in treason against the United States. And for that reason, Brandon Johnson should be arrested, charged with treason, convicted, and then given the requisite punishment for a capital offense. Will that ever happen? Probably not. But then again, just a few days ago, Tren de Aragua, they never thought that they'd be intercepted as they sped towards the United States on their drug boats. They certainly didn't imagine they'd get blown up without any warning. All indications are that we are entering a new phase of federal governance, one where the U.S. military acts to defend the American people, where false narratives from NGOs are ignored, where criminals are actually punished when they violate the law in public. So who knows? Maybe Brandon Johnson shouldn't be so confident. Like Washington, D.C., which has experienced something like a 50% drop in violent crime since the National Guard moved in, Chicago is about to become a much safer place. The more J.B. Pritzker lies about crime statistics, the more Brandon Johnson commits treason in public, the more obvious it becomes that this strategy needs to be applied to every major American city. Democrats have no response. They have no counter-argument. The safer America becomes, the more they will complain. And in response, every American who's paying attention will recognize their party for what it is. They are the party of chaos, crime, and cartels. And they should be treated accordingly. If you'd like to see what else I have to say, you can access my full show by going to dailywire.com or by going to the Matt Walsh Show Twitter page. Hope to see you there. Godspeed.